Greetings and welcome to this very first in a series of videos that will show you how to use SolidWorks, but more importantly, introduce you to solid modeling itself and good practices to use when doing this very interesting and useful skill. Now, what I'm showing you here is obviously not a solid modeling picture. It's a real picture of rivets. I want to emphasize that the examples that I use here are actually good for a lot of real useful types of designs. So to that effect, I'm going to be using things like rivets and real designs for real things. Now, if you actually made them, they could probably work. I do have a lot of simplifications, but I hope that you understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So let's go over to our solid modeling program. Here we are in our solid modeling program. The program I'm using is SolidWorks, and the thing I have here designed is a rivet, just like we were showing. Maybe not exactly like it, but I have my reasons for doing what I do. Now, before I get moving too far into it, I want to show you just a couple of things that I'm going to be using while I'm showing you around. If you'll notice, if you just move the cursor around the screen, nothing happens. If I use my left mouse button, when I click with my left mouse button, the red circles show up. If I click with my right mouse button, the blue circles show up. So here's left, here's right, left and right. Now if I use my middle mouse button, we don't have any circles that show up, but a different icon will show up here. So I'm going to hit my middle mouse button here, and you see that symbol come up. If I just hold my middle mouse button, I can rotate my model like this. If I hold my middle mouse button and I hold the control key down, this comes up and I can pan it back and forth. And then finally roll that middle mouse button away from you and it goes away, closer to you, and it gets closer. With some programs it's opposite, and sometimes I use both at the same time, so it gets a little confusing for me, but you get used to it after a while. So that middle mouse button is really helpful. Now if you're a little familiar with SolidWorks, you know what the toolbars are that are up here. If you don't know, if this is your very first SolidWorks video, you might want to go back on the playlist here and go back one and find that one that's a total introduction, as if you just turned the computer on. But just as a quick overview, making sure that you put that push pin in here so you can see all of these commands, that you see the features, sketch, evaluate, dim expert, but we're mostly going to focus on features and sketch. And then over here are our managers. So we got our feature manager, property manager, configuration manager, and so on and so forth. Now we'll almost exclusively be here at feature manager for the duration. So what I want you to do first is I want you to open up a new file. So click right up here, or you could go file new, but I'll just click right here. This pops up and the default is part, so we're going to take that and hit OK. Don't worry about these things unless you want to explore further, then you can use the tutorials and so on, but that's what you're here with me for. So let's just hit OK, and a new part comes up. Now we're going to have to start off with a couple things. So if you're in my class, make sure you do these things first. Okay, first, check to see that you're in the right units. Right now we're in millimeter grams second. I want to go to inch pound second. Okay, so check that first always. Now sometimes I have some of the diagrams in millimeters, so you got to check the assignment to figure out which is which. So I'm going to go with inch pound second. And if you didn't do that right away and you got further into your model and then you changed it to those units, some bad things could happen, so you'll have to watch out for that. I go into that a little bit later in some of the other videos, but That's why you should always try to do that first thing. Second thing, I want you to go up here to options. Now under options, you can change a lot of things. If you can play around with it if you want to, but for now, we're going to keep the default with this exception. Now I have mine already defaulted to ANSI, American National Standards Institute. Yours might be ISO. I want you always to keep it to ANSI, okay? For a handful of reasons, but mainly because that's what I like the most. And I want you to, for a secondary reason, know how to change your document properties. There are a number of other things that are very helpful here with respect to all the annotations and dimensions and so on. But for now, let's make sure that we are all using the same standard, and that's ANSI. All right, now the third thing that you should do before you lay down any sketches or lines yet is go to File and Save As, or Save depending on where you're at. Now, you always want to save. If you're in my class, you should really put your name with your part name. Okay, so your name and then Rivet will be fine. It's like putting your name at the top of a paper as if it were a test, or any other type of physical paper you would do. You would put this at the top of your paper. Well, this is going to show up at the top of your part, and that's how I can tell whose is whose. It'll be sent back to you if I don't see whose name is on the assignment. So make sure you put your name and then what it is, and there should be no problems. And do that first, because if you choose to do it later, there's all sorts of bad things that can happen when SolidWorks is looking for the one part that has a certain name, and you change the name just to put the name in later. It's not going to find it because it's looking for just Rivet when you want it to be looking for Joe Schmo Rivet. Then you turn it into me, and SolidWorks can't see it, and I give it back to you, and I say, it doesn't work. So make sure you do this first thing before you lay anything down. Now that we have our part file set up, we have the units, we have our drafting standard, we have our name. Now we are ready to start thinking about the part. And we're not ready to make it yet. We're ready to start thinking about it. Now, one of the most important lessons that we have today is how to do a revolved part. And that's this, revolved boss base. But I'm going to show you how it works first before we really get into too much sketching. Now, you always need to think about the part ahead of time. What's going to be front? What's top? What's right? Where is the most important point? This origin. Everything with SolidWorks has to revolve, to one extent or another, around the origin. This is how SolidWorks understands where things are. And so since that's how it works with the program, and it makes things easier for you if you think about it ahead of time, you have to understand your models and your parts and know what the most important location is in your part, or at least choose one that really is very logical. Okay, so before we do the rivet, I'm going to show you how to make a donut. All right, well, we can take this front plane or this top plane or this right plane and do a sketch on it. I'm going to choose the front plane here. And there's a couple ways of doing this. Remember, this is 3D modeling. We need to have 3 dimensions. And the first 2 dimensions are done in a sketch mode. And the sketch mode can be entered in a couple different ways. You can go right here to sketch and then sketch. And then it's going to ask you in this yellow box, always do what the yellow box is saying, where do you want to create this sketch? You need to have a plane on which to do this sketch. And so I chose the front plane, and it automatically, the first time, automatically went straight to a view which is normal to that plane. If it's later on and you're making other features, then it will not immediately go to that. You might have to change to that if you want to. But there's our front plane. Now our top plane is parallel to our vision, as is our right plane. So those two are straight in front of us, and the front plane is parallel to the screen here. Now when you do a revolved part, you always need to think of the center line. What's it going to revolve around? So the first thing you should lay down whenever you do a revolved part is a center line. So I'm just going to make one here, and it makes sense almost always to put that center line through the origin. And see these green things here? These are relations. These are things that either you can tell the computer to do, or in this case, the computer assumed that you wanted. The computer assumed I wanted this line to be horizontal. It assumed that I wanted this line to go through that point, or the origin. So those were pretty good assumptions, because that's kind of how I laid it in. If I were to make another center line like this, notice how I put it at an angle. I didn't put it through anything. Notice how it didn't make any of these green assumptions, these green relations. So, and that's how you make the lines, by the way. As you go up here and you can click on this, you can make regular lines that are solid, or you can make rectangles, and there's different types of rectangles. A corner, a center, that one's really nice to have, 3-point corner, and so on. You can make parallelograms. And so it's worth just playing around with some of these. Avoid the spline. A spline can be really cool, but oh my goodness, to get them right sometimes is difficult. It's worth playing around, but don't expect it to be easy. There's a lot of parameters that you can mess around with on the spline. This one's neat. You can just type it out and you get the actual lines there in the text. It's pretty neat. So anyway, back to making a revolved feature, basically a donut. I'm going to go up here to circle, and there's a few different ways of doing it. This is the most common: center and radius. And notice how I did it all on one side of the center line. That's how you have to do revolved parts, is you put everything that you've got on one side of the center line, and then you can revolve that 360 degrees around. If I put another circle on the other side and wanted to do it 180 degrees, the computer would have a real big problem with it. So just do one outline on one side of the center line and you'll be done. Now, if I want to get out of any command, all I have to do is hit the escape button in the upper left hand corner of your keyboard. Well, that got me out of making circles. Now, sometimes you have to hit the escape command a couple different times to get out of it, especially when you're doing dimensioning, which is what we're going to do next. Notice how the circle is blue. It's got a blue center, and actually these two ends are also blue. That means that the computer doesn't really know where those endpoints are. Well, I'm not worried about that on a center line that's a construction line. Sometimes I will need to use those, but in this case I don't. But over here, we do need to define what's going on. When you define your sketches, the computer knows where they are. So right now it doesn't know where this point is. It doesn't know if it's 2 inches or 2 miles from here. It doesn't know how big this circle is. So you can test by grabbing it, click here, and drag it out, and it keeps moving, which means the computer does not know how big it is. So we're going to dimension that. And the default dimension for a circle is a diameter, and we'll just make it 1.5 inches. And now if I try to make it larger or smaller, it won't let me. I keep trying to drag on it. It now knows what size it is, but it's still blue, you say. Well, that's true. It doesn't know where it is. Any of those points on the circle, it still doesn't know where it is. So I can actually take this center point and drag it around, and so it moves the circle all over the place, doesn't know where it is. So I'm going to tell the computer, oh, I want that point to be a certain distance away here, and we'll make it 2 inches away from the center line. Fine. But you say, guess what? I'm going to hit escape again, get out of that dimensioning thing. It still is blue. We want it to be black. Notice how this is black and this is blue. It still doesn't know where it is. Well, we're going to tell it not by dimensioning it, but by giving it a relation. We're going to click here, just once, hold the control key down, click on the origin, and then we're going to tell it to vertically align them. If I click here, now they're vertically aligned. We know this point is directly above this point, and we know how far, 2 inches, and we know how big it is, 1.5 inches. If we got rid of any one of these things, then the sketch would turn back to blue and it wouldn't know where it is. But now I can't drag it anywhere. I can't make it bigger, nothing like that. So it knows exactly where it is and it knows exactly how big it is. So it turns it all black. That's a good thing. Okay, so again, let's make this donut. We have everything in our sketch defined, and we go up here to exit the sketch. Now we could also go up to this upper left, or we can go up here. So here we have sketch 1. So all we did was create this sketch. So I'm going to go here to features, make a revolved boss base, and if I had pre-selected the sketch, it would have known what to do. But I had clicked off of that. So now I have to go back and select the sketch. Now here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to go and click on this sketch. Okay, and I'll show you why by clicking on the sketch. I'm going to do exactly what I'm not supposed to. I'm going to click right here. And yes, we made this beautiful donut almost. And the default is 360 degrees around. And it shows the line, the axis of revolution here perfectly because it's the only center line and we created it first. So if you do that, if you do it the way I'm showing you, these things will fall into place and your life will be a lot easier. So we take all the defaults and we're good to go. Now let's see if it did the bad thing I thought it would. No, it did not do the bad thing. So I guess in this case it's okay to do it. Well, one of these days I'll show you. If you go into my little video of tails and contours and other problems, you'll see some examples of what not to do. Anyway, that was one way of making the revolve. Now I'm just going to undo some things. There we go. So I undid this. And if instead I had simply selected the sketch first, right over here in Feature Manager, and then I click on Revolved Boss Base, boom, click the green button, and it's all done. We didn't need that second yellow menu to tell us what to do. So that's basically how this works. We have a sketch and it revolves it around an axis. That's all. And I'm back with a center line here, and I'm going to use that button to get back to my original view. If you get off of your original view by using the mouse button, you can just right click on sketch 1 and go right here, normal to, and boom, it'll pop right back to the normal to that sketch. Now for sketching the rivet. We're going to start off with a line here and going to bring it out here right along the axis. Now remember, we're only going to do half the rivet. And also, I'm not going to worry about being exactly perfect first time out. Click here. In fact, this is a little bit large because it's I've already set the scale. So it's 2 inches. I want this to be at about an inch, but that's okay. Just bring this up here, over like this, up like that. Notice how it shows 135 degrees. Now again, it's nice to have it close, but you don't have to have it exact. Up here, over here, and all the way back here. Now this little point down here is bothering me a little bit. I'm going to hit escape. Oh, okay. That point is just the end point of the center line. If I had had a point like that that looked like this, I'm going to hit escape to get out of there. See these two lines that are solid? You almost never want to do that. This little point can cause some problems. It's better to have one solid straight line than two shorter lines. There are other programs out there that are more like drafting programs where that's fine if that's how you want to draw your lines and it's just like drawing pencil lines. This is not one of them. You do not want to have anything extra like that. Okay, we have one more line to make. I'm going to go from this point up to, well, that's an interesting suggestion it made. All right, you got to watch out for those. Sometimes the computer is making these suggestions, and I know it's trying to be nice, but sometimes they're really not helpful. So you have to watch out for that, because it'll make those suggestions, put those relations in, and then you don't know why your sketch isn't working out the way you wanted it to. So got to watch out for that. Now I'm going to use center point arc here to make the dome for the rivet. Now this is not a full half dome, so watch out. The center is going to actually be somewhere here, but don't click on that point because that's the midpoint of this line. It's nice when this comes up when you want it, but we don't want it right now. I'm going to click right here, click here, and go up there. Now you're saying, wow, that was a really bad arc. You totally missed the end. And you know what? I don't care. There are a number of ways of bringing these 2 points together. I can do it by clicking here and dragging it up so that they meet up there. You see that yellow popping up saying that those are being merged. Or I can bring this one down and I get the same thing. Or I can take this cool command, trim entities. I can just cut the top off. I click on that, and then I use it like a razor blade, and I click and drag across, and it pops down to the next point. So those are 3 different ways of making those 2 points come together. Now I have my relations. Notice how these relations kicked in. That's vertical, that's horizontal. Not only is that vertical, but I made sure that this, see how I point at this, and this comes right on top of the origin. This line is right over that origin. They are coincident. Geometrically, they are coincident. Even though the origin isn't on this line segment, it's on the line that goes infinitely. So we've got this being horizontal, that one being vertical, that one being horizontal, that being on the line, that being on the line. So all of these relations have really helped us define what we're really looking for. And now all we have to do is put in dimensions. For dimensioning, we're going to use this smart dimension thing. Now, sometimes smart dimension is what it says. It's smart, and sometimes it's not so smart. But most of the time it's pretty good. I'm going to zoom in here. And one thing I really want to emphasize is that when you make linear dimensions, for example, the overall dimension from left to right here, you could go from point to point. But notice how if you do it at the wrong angle, something funky happens. Okay? And it may not be what you're looking for. In fact, if it's not this obvious, you might just say, okay, I'm going to take that, and it might be wrong. How do we avoid getting these decisions? Well, don't use points if you can avoid it. So we're going to go from, instead, point to the line. Okay, I'll show you one more time. I'm going to go from the very top. Can't avoid using a point there, but we can use this line. If we use this line, we know that it is a going to be with respect to this line, which is going up and down, which means it has to go left and right. There's no other way that this dimension can work. So if at all possible, go from line to something, and maybe even line to line. Okay, so I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to try to squeeze this down to the 1.25 that the drawing shows. Okay, it changed the scale, which is great, so we got through that. Now another way of making dimensions is if you just have an entire line segment from here to here, you can just click on that line and pull it up like this. And we want this to be 1 inch. And notice how every time I'm clicking left, you will see those red circles, and right, you will see the blue circles. Okay, let's try this one more time, just for demonstration's sake. All I had to do is click on that one line, click up here, make it 1 inch, and all's good. Now, I want to show you a very important way of making diameters. Someone might say, well, hey, if I only do half of this revolve thing, I only get to do radiuses from here to here. But you would expect someone to want to have a diameter across this. Well, never fear, that is totally possible, and in fact encouraged. If I go from the center line to this line, I will have a radius of 0.27. But if instead all I have to do is click on it and I hit the delete button to delete it, if I go from the center line up here and I take it and I go down on the other side of the center line, I end up with a diameter. This is not just encouraged but required. You have to use diameters where it makes sense. And in fact, we use diameters a lot in engineering compared to radii. Okay, so that dimension is supposed to be 0.38. And you know what? You see all these other things now, it's all crossed and weird. That's okay. We will take care of that. So I'm going to dimension this now with respect to the center line, and comes out to 0.25. And now the problem is this thing. I gotta hit escape again to get out of dimensioning mode, so I can grab this point and I can just drag it down here. Not a problem. And this dimension is supposed to be 45 degrees with respect to the flat. Go back to dimensioning, go from here to here, and notice how I could put the dimension here, but this could also show up. This is the reflex angle, and this is the obtuse angle. So just matters where you put your mouse button, and you'll get those different angles depending on what you need. So I'll make that 45 degrees. Now there's another dimension on the drawing that goes from this point to this flat, and 0.03 there. Notice how in this area things are starting to become black and not blue. So the next one is 30 degrees with respect to the flat, like this. And then there's a depth from here to the flat, and that is a 1/4 inch. And all of these details are now black. They are well defined. You can identify every place on this line with respect to the origin. But the rest of these, not so much. This changes. The length of this line changes. Oh, in fact, this line doesn't even have a horizontal assumption here. So we're going to make this line collinear with that line. So I selected both of them using the control key, and I'm going to click on collinear, which means they share the same line, falls into place, and everything is good. Haha, it turned black. So the only thing left is this. And that dimension is the radius of the dome. I had previously selected this point down here for whatever reason. So I'm going to hit escape. That's what I mean by smart dimensioning. Sometimes it reads your mind well and other times it doesn't. So if I just get out of smart dimensioning by hitting the escape key, I'll go back in, click this, and then the radius comes up. So enter 0.38, and now everything is black. And that means it's all well defined. Now it's also good form to move the dimensions around so that they're legible. For the models, it's less important because people aren't as likely to read them, but it's still good form to do so. And here's our 30, 25, and 38. So we are all set here. It's all nice and neat. And now we are done with our sketch. So going back to what we did before, we're going to click on Revolve Boss Base, but we wanted to make it nice and sweet, so we're going to select our sketch first, go to Revolve Boss Base, everything is the way it should be, and hit our green check mark, and here it is. Next thing you should do is save it. There we go. So notice how the asterisk went away. If you have an asterisk here, that means you did something to change it and you haven't saved it since your most recent change. Okay, a couple more things I want to show you are over here. See how the sketch shows up if I roll over it? Well, maybe you wanted to look at it a little bit more often than just having it rolled over. You can have it show by right-clicking and going to this eyeball here and clicking on show. And now you see that the sketch shows up even as you rotate things around. And also the symbol changes from a thin black line to a nice blue line. I'm going to right-click on it again, go to hide. Now revolve, I can do the same thing with the entire thing. I can hide it and it goes away, and you just see this vague outline only because it's selected. If I select sketch, then Revolve 3 goes away. Click here, it all goes away. If I right click on it again, go to the eye, brings it back. Okay, well, one last thing I want to mention over here is this origin. Notice how I carefully chose its location with respect to the rest of the part. There are a couple of other places you could put it. Maybe the top of the dome, maybe where the dome meets the shaft. Any of those places would be fine, but you should be thinking about it ahead of time. And it's where these different planes meet. Now, we use the front plane, which in fact probably shouldn't have, and if you instead had used the top or the right plane, you would do better maybe in the resulting assembly with the handle. And one last thing that I almost forgot, but I just showed you how to do, is if you want to go back and change your sketch, you just need to right click on it and go right here to edit sketch. And then you can change your sketch in any way that you think is necessary. Up here is where we click on exit sketch, and here we can change our feature. And if I wanted it to do 270 degrees, I could do that too. And now I bit a little bit out of it. To do undo, just hit Control Z and it goes away. And finally, after you've made all your changes and you're happy, hit the save button. In fact, you should save it a lot more often than when you're happy. Now, one last thing that I'm not going to go through on this because it might take some more time. but you should really go to the next video, not for the saw, but for the tails and contours and so on, common mistakes and problems video, because you'll understand it a lot more now, but it'll also save you a lot of time and hassle and headache in the future if you go check that one out. Okay, so in this video, we introduced a little bit of sketching, and we talked about the revolve. And when we went to the sketch, we focused on thinking about the geometry to begin with, about putting a center line through the origin, where the origin should be, and then we did the sketch. Now, we didn't even bother with the dimensions until we got our relations all set up and made sure that they were all good. But we saw that our sketch was all blue, and even with the relations, most of them were still blue. So we went back and we did the dimensioning, and in so doing, we learned a few things about, for example, doing diameters and angles and radii, and how to do linear dimensions, preferably to lines themselves. Or you can just click on the one line if that's all you need, is that distance of that line. Once we were done with the sketch, we selected our sketch and went to Revolved Boss Base, and we just took the defaults and it rotated around and made our rivet. Also, we learned how to set up a part for this course, how to save it properly. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to watch the problems video and then continue on with the saw videos.